Hello, my name is Alex and I am the Silvermont, and in this video we'll be talking video games. Inspirational video games of the past 15 years. But what does that mean? Well, specifically I am talking about games that had a large impact on the industry, games that inspired other developers to try something similar, or caused an influx of clone games, or perhaps even the creation of a new genre, or subgenre, mini-genre of game. The quality of the game, or how much I personally enjoyed it, isn't the point here, but rather it is to discuss the impact they had on the industry as a whole. And by no means is this supposed to be entirely in-depth. I don't even have entirely relevant footage for some of the games. But it's just a topic I thought was interesting and could be fun to discuss. And I'll be focusing on several games in particular: Devil May Cry, Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, The Elder Scrolls, Skyrim, and Dark Souls. I was also going to talk about World of Warcraft and MMOs, but maybe that's something for another video entirely. These are by no means the only games that have had an impact on the industry, but they are several examples I can think of that I've also played extensively to some degree or another. So let's start with Devil May Cry. Released back in 2001, when I was around 11, Devil May Cry started life as a Resident Evil game, Resident Evil 4 in particular if I recall correctly. But it quickly turned into something new. There was nothing particularly groundbreaking about the graphics or story of Devil May Cry, and it has some infamously cheesy lines of dialogue. Where Devil May Cry broke new ground was in the gameplay. There have been other fast, stylish combat games before Devil May Cry, I'm sure, but Devil May Cry practically created the subgenre known as character action. But what exactly is character action? The term gets thrown around a lot, and people can generally agree on examples of character action games: Devil May Cry, Ninja Gaiden, Bayonetta, Metal Gear Rising, and so forth. But there are no strict rules or guidelines here as to what makes up a character action game. But it is quite a specific type of game, and arguably Devil May Cry was the first. And that'll be another theme of the video, how certain genres have evolved over time. And as it should, the character action genre has evolved over time, as a whole and within its specific franchises. Devil May Cry, for example, introduced multiple characters, multiple styles, and even began moving away from fixed camera angles in later entries, although many agree that the franchise peaked with Devil May Cry 3, itself already 10 years old. Personally, I think the newest entry in the franchise, DMC, Devil May Cry, is actually a regression and a pile of hot garbage, but that's just me. So how about Call of Duty? Arguably the largest franchise here with the biggest impact. I played the first Call of Duty when it came out in 2004 or so, but there was nothing mind-blowing about it. But then when the fourth game came out in 2007, Modern Warfare blew everything and everyone away. Whether or not it created its own mini or subgenre is up for debate, but personally I would say that even if it didn't create it, it popularized the cinematic shooter genre. Just like Gears of War popularised the third-person cover-based shooter, even though Killswitch and Metal Gear Solid had been using cover systems years before Gears of War came out. But following the release of Call of Duty 4, we've had at least 5 years of COD clones, brown military shooters. They dominated the gaming landscape from 2008 to at least 2012. And it wasn't just the cinematic campaign that COD brought to the landscape, it was also the multiplayer system. Levels, perks, kill streaks, prestige, and so on. Most of these are now standard for many multiplayer games. How many multiplayer shooters come out without, like, a level system, with a ranking system? Not too many. Call of Duty 4 essentially shaped the modern multiplayer shooter, I'd say at least. But in recent years I feel like as a franchise it has been losing steam. I'm sure it still sells millions of copies, and Call of Duty 4 itself has sold something like 15 million I believe. But there's only so much people can take before franchise fatigue begins to take place. Assassin's Creed has been doing annual releases since the dawn of time, it feels like, and it is suffering from franchise fatigue. It's the best example of franchise fatigue, I would say. But the next game we're going to be talking about is spaced out a little more evenly. It is, of course, Skyrim. Is there anyone who doesn't know Skyrim? Something about this game caused it to explode in popularity. A lot of franchise fans consider it inferior to Oblivion and even Morrowind, but And whilst I don't have any solid numbers, Skyrim seems to have sold well over 20 million copies. And a re-release is on the way soon, so it's gonna be selling even more. Whereas Oblivion seems to be less than half that number, and the first 2 games, they probably sold a fraction of that. Maybe it took advantage of the growing Minecraft craze, maybe it had something to do with Fallout 3, or maybe they grew in tandem, but Skyrim was, and remains, absolutely massive. Now personally, I find it a little odd that a game with such glaring flaws and kind of low quality across the board became so massively successful. There are plenty of valid complaints when it comes to Call of Duty, for example. But Call of Duty 4 was a good game when it comes to quality. It performs well, it had advanced visuals for the time. But Skyrim? It was a very buggy, glitchy game with huge performance problems. It almost feels jury-rigged together. It doesn't feel like a high-quality game to me. In spite of that though, it was massively successful and had a massive impact on the gaming landscape. Just off the top of my head, I can think of plenty of games that have been inspired by it. One of my favourite games, Dragon's Dogma included. I feel that perhaps it isn't the quality of Skyrim itself, but rather the concept of Skyrim, what it represents, the boundless possibilities of open world adventure. And open world games are all the rage these days, to the point of oversaturation, I'd say. Bethesda don't put out Elder Scrolls games every year though, which I think is definitely the right decision, considering thousands of people are still playing Skyrim and Oblivion every day, all these years after release. And splitting your player base over dozens of games isn't a good move in my opinion. You've probably noticed the big trend lately too. Lots of Japanese developers are making Skyrim-inspired open world games. Dragon's Dogma, Final Fantasy 15, Metal Gear Solid 5, and so on. And there was a poll a few years back asking Japanese game directors and developers, what is your favourite game that you've been playing? And almost all of them were saying Skyrim. But Western developers take inspiration from Japanese titles too, and Dark Souls, the last game I want to talk about here, is a perfect example of that. Call of Duty 4 popularised a trend of cinematic experience games, of which there are dozens of examples, Uncharted being one of the most successful. But all of these games steered away from the challenging aspect that video games held in the past, and Dark Souls brought that back in a very big way. Dark Souls was the antithesis of cinematic style Uncharted-esque games. Was Dark Souls the hardest game ever? Well, no, but in contrast, in the environment it was released in, it was radical at the time. It was a relatively hard, wildly popular game with, like, no cutscenes and no overbearing tutorials and all that stuff. Oh yeah, Dark Souls did have cutscenes, but it wasn't like you start the game and get 30 minutes of cutscenes before you play, you know? Whilst Dark Souls never had the sort of market saturation that Skyrim and Dark Souls achieved, it was, and remains, a big name that has only grown over the years. And because of that, we've had a surge of hardcore games following the route Dark Souls took. Which is still funny to me, as I don't think Dark Souls was ever really designed to be some ultra-punishing, hardcore game that only masters could defeat. I mean, I think League of Legends is more hardcore than Dark Souls. For the record, I don't like League of Legends, but when I played it, I had no idea what was going on, and you needed such a depth of knowledge of all these minute gameplay mechanics that is what I would consider hardcore, whereas Dark Souls, you don't need to read all the wikis, you can just start Dark Souls up and play, and succeed and have fun. I know a lot of people might disagree and say, oh no, Dark Souls doesn't explain anything, but I would argue that a lot of the things in Dark Souls you don't need to understand. You can just play the game. I mean, hell, I did it. A lot of people did it. They just put the game in and played. As opposed to League of Legends and Dota, where you do need to know all these items and builds for your character, or you'll just get shouted at by people in the community. Unless, like, you're playing bot matches or something, I suppose. But that's how it all went. Now we have dozens of Dark Souls-inspired games, whether they are straight-up clones, such as Lords of the Fallen, or games merely taking inspiration from Dark Souls, such as the asynchronous multiplayer elements, which can be found in titles as far from Dark Souls as you could imagine, like Watch Dogs. And then we've also got all the stupid X is the Dark Souls of Y style comments, which are getting a little out of hand. Either way, it's really interesting at least to me, to see how these trends come into play. Makes you wonder what'll be next. I mentioned League of Legends a bit, and, well, yes, these, what are they called, MOBAs? I just call them Dota clones. These League of Legends games, they are absolutely massive, although whether they're growing or shrinking at this point, it's hard to say. And just recently we've had Overwatch, the hero FPS, or I don't know what the I don't know how you want to explain that. The TF2 clone, we've had that recently. Is that going to be the next big thing? Maybe. Maybe it'll be VR. I wasn't a fan of motion control gaming, and I'm not thinking too highly on virtual reality either, but I haven't tried virtual reality, so maybe I'm just jumping the gun there. But it's always interesting to see where the industry is heading. That said, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.